The last lecture focused on the sack of Rome in 410. And the sack of Rome was an event with a real and powerful symbolic importance. And this, of course, happens when a place that's the center of the largest state in the Mediterranean is sacked for the first time in 800 years. But at the same time, the sack of Rome was not just a symbolic catastrophe. It was also something that had real consequences for the future. And so the next three lectures are going to look at the fate of a number of regions that were under the control of the Roman Emperor in 400, but were not under the control of the Roman Emperor in 500. And what we'll see is a set of places that were once fully a part of the Roman state, gradually drifting away from that state. But each region has a different process that unfolds, and each region has a different outcome because of this. So each of these places that have been, to this point, integrated into our discussion of an entire Roman Empire now needs to be separated out. And so we'll look at each of these regions differently and give them their own focus in each of these lectures. The story today is going to center on the area of Gaul. And the story in Gaul is somewhat complicated, if only because it involves two different barbarian groups, both of whom were at times allied with the Roman state. But the key event setting all of this off is the sack of Rome by Alaric, and ultimately the crossing of the Rhine frontier by other barbarian groups. Now, when the Vandals, Alans, and Suevi cross the Rhine when it freezes in 406, a tribe that's long been an ally of the Romans makes a much more subtle move, and this is the Franks. So on the map, you can see Franki Riparii and Franki Sali, and in between those two regions, those two Frankish regions, is the Rhine River. And in 407, as Roman authority in northern Gaul begins to collapse, the Salian Franks wander across and take up some territory, take control of some territory, basically what's now part of the Netherlands, Belgium, and part of northern France. And they get as far as the Somme River. Now, the Romans didn't have much capacity to deal with this. If you remember the situation in 407, this is the moment when Stilicho is trying to deal with the crossings of the Vandals, Alans, and Suevi and their movement deep into Gaul, while confronting a usurpation and dealing with Alaric. And so the movement of the Franks into an area that is underutilized and distant from the Romans' ability to really control and patrol that territory is something that is not ideal, but it's not a top priority for the Romans to deal with either. And the Romans don't really have the capacity to go back and deal with it later, because as we know, the situation with Alaric gets more and more inflamed until in 410, Alaric sacks the city of Rome. And then Alaric's followers, a group of people that we call Goths, but really a group that represents a core that may well have been Gothic, but also includes freed slaves, it includes Romans who have deserted, it includes other barbarians in Roman military service who decided that they had better prospects with Alaric's group. This group of people that we call Goths because it's simpler is really a much more diverse and larger group than the group of people who actually rebelled under Alaric in 395. And so when Alaric leads this group into southern Italy, it's a relatively substantial and diverse group. And Alaric had, it seemed, initially hoped that he could take this group across into Sicily and perhaps establish themselves in Sicily, but he couldn't get enough boats. And so the group of Goths go to the southern part of Italy, and then they have to turn around and start moving back north. While they're doing this, Alaric himself dies. And the Goths are so troubled by what will happen to his body that they end up diverting a river and burying Alaric in the riverbed, then running the river back over it, so that the Romans can't come back and later desecrate his grave. Now, after years of raiding, these Goths eventually cross from Italy into Gaul in 412, and then in response to a rebellion against Honorius, they actually ally with Honorius and work to recover territory for him. And again, Honorius behaves like he has with the Goths. he disregards them, and they then seize the city of Narbonne, the capital of the Gallic province. And in response to this, the leader of the Goths at this moment also weds Galla Placidia, who is the half-sister of Honorius, who had been captured during the sack of Rome and had been traveling with the Goths since then. Eventually, Honorius sends a large concentration of troops against the Goths, and they're blockaded until they agree to cooperate with the Romans by attacking the Vandals and Alans, and in return for their service, they're granted some recognition. The imperial court gives them effective control of the provinces of Aquitaine. And you see on the map, on the very sort of top of the map, you see Aquitania. And so this is where the Goths are settled. And the terms of the agreement are relatively unique. The Goths are permitted to live independently under their own laws and under their own political arrangement. The land of the Romans in Aquitaine is partially divided among the Visigoths. And when we talk about Goths, what we will see in a subsequent lecture is there are two groups of Goths that come to the west. The group under Alaric's initial rebellion that ends up settling in Aquitaine and then eventually expanding into other territories in Spain and southern Gaul. We call this group Visigoths because this is a term that means Western Goths. The other group, called Ostrogoths, eventually take control of Italy in the 490s, and they're called Ostrogoths because simply they are Goths and Italy is east of Spain. And so the Visigoths are the Western Goths, the Ostrogoths are the Eastern Goths. And this isn't really a concept that would be particularly meaningful in the 410s. These are just Goths. And so in the 410s, the Goths are permitted to live under their own laws. The land of the Romans is partially divided among them. The Romans remain subjects of Honorius, the Goths remain subjects of the Gothic king, and the Goths are bound by an alliance with the Romans, but they are not under Roman control. And so when you parse this, what you realize is what has effectively happened is the Roman state has given territory in Gaul to the Goths. And those Goths are not subject to the rule of the emperor. Now, in theory, Romans in that territory are subject to the rule of the emperor. And so legally speaking, Aquitaine has not shifted from Roman control to the control of an independent Gothic kingdom. Rome has not recognized an independent Gothic kingdom officially, but effectively this is an independent Gothic kingdom. And there's a religious significance to this as well. The Goths are Aryans, unlike the Romans, who are Catholics. Now, eventually, when we trace the story further, what we see is the Goths, from this initial settlement, begin to assert complete control over Aquitaine, and then as we move through the 5th century, they begin expanding, first into Spain, and then into southern Gaul, until in 475, 60 years after, or nearly 60 years after this treaty is made, the Roman Emperor Julian Nepos acknowledges the reality that has effectively been there since the 410s. And he acknowledges that the Gothic kingdom is an independent kingdom, and he acknowledges Gothic control over all of the territory that they have seized in their intervening 60 years. And so the state that's created, and the state that Romans implicitly acknowledged to be independent in the 410s and explicitly acknowledged to be independent in the 470s, is an Aryan-dominated state. At least the administrative and ruling classes are Aryan-dominated. And this has real advantages. Because, as I said, the Goths converted to Christianity under the Emperor Constantius. They converted to an Arian version of Christianity. And when they take control of Spain and southern France, that territory is overwhelmingly majority Roman and Catholic. And so what the Goths are able to do is maintain a degree of distinction between themselves and the people living under them by maintaining this religious distinction. It's clear who is part of this administrative structure, who is part of this ruling structure, based on the sort of Christology that they embrace. Now, sometimes, though, the Arianism of the Goths created real problems. And so as time passed, the Gothic state became more developed and less fearful of Rome, and the religious differences became more acute as this state confronted Rome. And so in one case in the 470s, when the final terms under which the Goths will exercise their independence is being kind of fought out with the Romans, what we see is the Gothic King Yorick actually institutes a persecution over Romans in territory that he has just seized from the empire. And so in 475, Yorick launches an attack against Roman territory in what's now Provence. And when he does this, when he conquers this territory, he begins a persecution of the Christians in Gaul in the territory that he has just taken. And so we're told by Gregory of Tours, who's writing after the fact, without much ado, Yorick cut the heads off of all of those who had not subscribed to his heretical opinions. He imprisoned the priests, and the bishops either drove into exile or he had them executed. He also ordered all doorways to the churches to be blocked, so that the very difficulty of finding one's way in might encourage men to forget their Christian faith. So how do we understand this? Basically what we have here is Yorick conquering territory from the Roman Empire, territory that has no significant Aryan presence at all, where most of the people are Catholic Christians. And what Yorick is doing is trying to destroy the structure of the Catholic Christian establishment in this formerly Roman territory so that there can't be any kind of insurgency or resistance led by those Catholic bishops. And so what you have here is a conqueror instituting a persecution against newly conquered Catholics. And the persecution consists of destroying the high levels of the hierarchy of the Catholic Church so that these people cannot organize a resistance to Yorick and his Goths. On one level, this makes a lot of sense. But on another level, this is seen as something that, of course, feeds into a long Christian tradition of resisting persecution. And so while Gregory is writing about this long after the time, we also have a discussion of this persecution that comes from someone who lived through it. This person is Sidonius of Polaneris. And Sidonius really is a transitional figure. He's really remarkable. He's from the city of Clermont-Ferrand in what's now southern France. And he's a classically trained scholar who knew very well the works of people like Pliny and is an exceptionally good stylist and rhetorician. And Sidonius had served as a senator while his area of Gaul was still under Roman control. And he'd been so successful that he was actually appointed to high positions in the Roman court and was even made prefect of the city of Rome in the late 460s. But when things began to fall apart, they fell apart quickly. And when Clermont shifted from Roman control to Gothic control, all of a sudden, Sidonius, the Roman senator, the former prefect of the city of Rome, no longer lived under Roman control, and his horizons shrunk accordingly. And so this man who had lived his whole life under a Roman imperial system was now faced with a completely alien political system. And to function in this new system, he became the bishop of Clermont-Ferrand. Now, Sidonius is a good model for this sort of bishop. He is, in a sense, a 5th century version of the same kind of figure that Ambrose of Milan was, except that with this changing world, Sidonius's connections to the empire all of a sudden mean nothing. And so Sidonius makes a very clear stand against Yorick and his actions when Yorick comes in. And so we have here a letter that Sidonius writes as things are unfolding, as the actions of Yorick and his incursion into southern Gaul is kind of in its initial phases. And so Sidonius writes that no one can here fitly discuss or me, a sinner, indict the action of Yorick the Goth in breaking and bearing down an ancient treaty to defend, or rather extend by armed force, the frontiers of his kingdom. I must confess that as formidable as the mighty Goth may be, I dread him less as an assailant of our walls than as a subverter of our Christian laws. And so what Sidonius is saying on the verge of the incursion that Yorick is making is Yorick is breaking a peace treaty, and that's terrible. But what Sidonius really fears is that Yorick will actually undermine Christian faith. He cares less about whether Yorick takes his city than what Yorick will do to Christianity. And his concern is borne out by this. He says that they say that the mere mention of the name of Catholic so embitters his countenance and heart that one might take him for the chief priest of his Aryan sect, rather than for the monarch of his nation. So omnipotent in arms, keen-witted, and in the full vigor of life, he yet makes this single mistake. He attributes his success and his designs and enterprises to the orthodoxy of his belief, but the real cause lies in mere earthly fortune. And so what Sidonius is saying is that Yorick actually sees himself, or is claiming that he is, motivated by and empowered by the strong sense of his Aryan faith. But really what Sidonius is emphasizing is it's not Arianism that makes Yorick so powerful. It's that Yorick has more powerful troops, and Yorick therefore has worldly success. It's not divine success. It's not success that's ordained by God. It's instead something that happens because of worldly features. And the persecution then is really badly conceived of. The persecution that Yorick will launch is not something Yorick believes. It's something that comes out of the fact that he is empowered by God to promote Arianism. But Sidonius says that's not correct at all. He's misreading the situation. God has not empowered him. He's just empowered because he has bigger armies. And so if he acts on that capacity and believes he has a divine mandate to persecute Catholics, that's wrong. And fundamentally, it's problematic. And so Sidonius says, in response, I would have you consider the secret malady of the Catholic Church, that you may apply some kind of remedy. Because Bordeaux, Périgueux, Rhodes, Limoges, Javal, Uz, Bazas, Comprises, Auch, and many other cities like it are bodies which have lost their heads through the death of their respective bishops, and no successors have been appointed to fill their places and maintain the ministry in the lower orders of the church. The boundaries of spiritual desolation are extended far and wide. And so this is the effect of Yorick's persecution. It, in a sense, did exactly what Yorick intended for it to do. It cut the heads off of the various prominent Catholic churches in the region that he has just taken from Roman control. And with this, the church now cannot mount an effective response. And so Sidonius is asking for someone to do something, for some solution to be found. But what we can see is there are overlying layers to why this persecution happens. On one level, the persecution happens because this is a way for Yorick to consolidate control over new territory that he has just taken. On another level, the persecution happens, Sidonius says, and Catholics believe, because of the heresy of Yorick. And this opens a really significant line of response for the Franks. And we'll talk about this in a minute. But basically what you see here is Yorick is using religious divisions to try to enhance his ability to absorb the territory that he's just taken from the Romans. And so the persecution and the invasion are linked. And the invasion, because it has been successful, creates the need for the persecution because that allows Yorick to consolidate control. Now, the Aryan Visigoths are the main player in southern Gaul as you get out of the 5th century. But in northern Gaul, the Franks will be the main player. And the story of the Franks is somewhat different from the story that you see with the Goths. The Franks had been suppressed pretty violently by the Emperor Julian in the 360s, and had more or less remained good Roman allies since. And so they fought against Rome and alongside the Visigoths in 425, but most of the time they actually cooperated with the Romans, including most notably in 451 when they provided troops that worked and fought alongside the Romans to confront Attila the Hun. Now, because the Franks had been largely loyal, the Roman state didn't do very much to respond to the power base they were building in northern Gaul. Especially with southern Gaul cut off from northern Gaul, the state really lacked the capacity to do very much to do this. And so eventually the Franks fully emerged from Roman political dominance. And the full emergence happens really in the 480s under a particular Frankish leader, Clovis. Now, Clovis was a very effective military leader in Gaul. And the main move he makes against the Romans comes in 486. This is a really interesting moment because in 486, we're told that Clovis launches an attack against Syagrius, the king of the Romans and the son of Aegidius, who was living in the city of Soissons, where Aegidius himself used to have residence. And Clovis marched against him, and they fought against each other, and the army of Syagrius was annihilated. And at that time, a great many churches were plundered by Clovis, for he still held fast to his pagan idolatries. Now, there are a number of things that are very interesting about this passage in Gregory of Tours. First, Syagrius. Now, Syagrius is not king of the Romans. What Syagrius, it seems, is a military commander of some sort who was governing territories that remained independently controlled by Romans while the rest of Gaul had fallen away. And so Syagrius in 486 has nothing to do and no real communication with the Roman imperial court. It has no communication with the actual Roman state that is still intact but far away from him. He's a Roman controlling Romans in a territory that has remained Roman but is surrounded by barbarian kingdoms. And so Syagrius is, in some ways, we can imagine, like a kind of Gallic King Arthur, rallying what remains of Romanness against all of this chaos around him. And in 486, Clovis attacks him and reduces his territory and absorbs what's left of this independent Roman kingdom or independent Roman state in northern Gaul. The other thing that's interesting is, of course, Clovis at this point is still pagan. And so when he takes the territory of Syagrius, he plunders the churches. Now, later in his reign, though, we hear of a change of belief on his part. And this is because even though Clovis himself was pagan, he was married to a Christian, and there were a lot of Christians in the territory under his control. And so we're told that his conversion happened like this. War broke out against the Alemanni, and in this conflict, Clovis was forced by necessity to accept what he'd refused of his own free will. And so it turned out that when the two armies met on the battlefield, there was great slaughter, and the troops of Clovis were rapidly being annihilated. And so he raised his eyes to heaven when he saw this, and he felt compunction in his heart and was moved to tears. Jesus Christ, he said, you who Clotilde, his wife, maintains to be the Son of the living God, in faith I beg your help. If you give me victory over my enemies, I will believe in you, and I will be baptized in your name. Now, the story here is deliberately told in a way that mirrors that of Constantine. What we see here is an emperor, or a king in this case, struggling to deal with a battlefield adversary and being very concerned that he doesn't have the capacity to do it. And so he prays. Now, in Constantine's case, this unfolds in a little bit different way because Jesus is a somewhat distinct and distant figure. But Clovis knows about Jesus. His wife is a Christian. And so when Clovis prays, he prays to Jesus because he knows Jesus is the one to whom he should pray. Jesus then intervenes, Clovis wins his victory, and Clovis converts to Christianity. But what's interesting is the conversion, or the Christianity that Clovis converts to. Because other barbarian kings, people like Yorick of the Visigoths, converted to Arianism. Clovis is the only one of the major barbarian kings to take over in territory once ruled by Rome who converts directly to Catholicism. And this is a very smart thing to do. Not only is this the Christianity he's most familiar with, but it's also the Christianity that most of his subjects believe in. And so while Yorick and the Goths in southern France and Spain have created a structure where their Christianity is distinct from the Christianity of the Romans who they rule, Clovis has embraced the Christianity of the Romans that he rules. And, importantly, he has also embraced the Christianity of the Romans who are subject to the Aryan Goths. And so what this means is very clear. Clovis has his eye on these territories controlled by the Visigoths in southern France. And because he has his eye on these territories, as well as the territories of the Burgundians, he understands that he has a bit of a way in to secure the allegiance of the populations there, because as a Catholic sovereign, they are likely to prefer him to the Aryan Christian sovereigns who are controlling that territory now. And so in the same way that Yorick uses the division between Catholics and Arians to emphasize and build up his control of that territory by destroying any resistance, Clovis can capitalize on Catholic dissatisfaction with Arian control and build support for himself if he then intervenes and takes this territory away from barbarian control. And so in a sense, this is the post-Roman world 2.0. The first version of the post-Roman world involves people like Yorick taking territory from the empire and dismantling the administrative and authoritative structures that would enable Romans to organize and resist their incorporation into our barbarian kingdom. But now those Romans are under barbarian control. And what Clovis realizes is there's a great benefit to being able to come in as a Catholic sovereign and offer liberation to these Catholic populations from the control of an Arian sovereign who has persecuted them. And this is what Clovis does. The Franks begin absorbing territories of the Burgundians and of the Alemanni, and eventually defeat the Visigoths and push the Visigoths out of Gaul and down across the Pyrenees into Spain. And this is the reincorporation of this territory into a Catholic monarchy is something that is welcomed by the Catholic Romans in that territory. And so in one way, by the end of the 6th century, Gaul is almost fully under the control of the Franks. But the political structure of the Frankish kingdom, even though the kingdom itself is quite large, the political structure of the Frankish kingdom is very unsophisticated. And so when Clovis dies in 511, each of his sons got control of part of the territory, 4 parts of the territory, divided up between the 4 sons. And so while the Franks continue to dominate Gaul in the 6th century, they don't do it as a unified group. Instead, what you see is this. This is what Gaul looks like in the year 600. And the effect of this system is, of course, something that is quite politically disruptive and also economically disruptive. So we have to remember that what came before this was a pretty sophisticated and well-organized Roman state. It had a tax structure, a legal system that worked through trials, and a large sort of way of keeping track of who owned what territory and how much tax was due on that territory. The Roman state had the tax collecting ability to bring these resources into a centralized area, and it had administrative capacity to take those resources and redistribute them back out. And this was defined clearly through a set of provinces, cities, and central authorities. But once the Franks took control of this, much of this system broke down. Now, the historian Walter Goffert has a way of thinking about the absorption of Gaul that is controversial and creative. What Goffert basically says is, when this territory came under control of the Goths, 2/3 of the property in Aquitaine went to the Goths, 1/3 remained in Roman hands, but really what happened was the tax revenue was spread along these lines, and the revenue from the land was spread along these lines, but no land was actually appropriated. Instead, what happened was the tax revenue was just distributed. But what we've seen in texts like Paulinus of Pella show that really things are a lot more complicated. I mean, the administrative structure to uphold all of this doesn't actually seem like it's able to do what Goffert describes. And so Paulinus of Pella describes what happens to his property. He says that my property I was able to hold on to at Marseille, and it was retained by me under terms of a contract. And you raised up a purchaser for me among the Goths who desired to acquire the small farm that was once entirely mine. and of his own accord sent me a sum, not indeed equitable, but nevertheless a godsend. And so what we see here is something that kind of muddies the waters. Because what Paulinus is saying in essence is it's not clear that the legal system can maintain people's hold on property. It's not clear that Paulinus could actually retain that small farm if he wanted to. But it's also not clear that the Goth can just take it. Instead, what you have is this kind of gray area where people negotiate out of positions where they're not totally sure what their legal power is and what their legal standing and the legal authority over their territory that they supposedly own actually will be. And so you have something that is chaotic. Now, the orderly system of property possession and taxation almost certainly falls apart in these conditions. If you don't know who owns this land, and in this time of land changing hands between Goths and ultimately Franks and Romans, the records are not maintained. It's very, very hard for the tax system the Romans had set up and maintained to actually function. And so I think there's a real challenge to Goffard's idea, because the administrative sophistication probably does not exist to do what Goffard suggests. Certainly not by the end of the 5th century. Another way that you can see this play out is by looking at the functioning of the legal system in Frankish Gaul. And so Gregory of Tours preserves one of the more amusing cases in Frankish legal history that really shows how, for lack of a better term, messed up the Frankish legal system has become. And so Gregory describes for us a conflict that develops when a man named Sikar gets into trouble with one of his neighbors. So the story plays out this way. When Sikar, the son of John, was enjoying himself in the village of Montholon as part of the Christmas festivities with Ostrogiesel and a number of other local folk, the village priest sent one of his servants to invite some of the men to come and have a drink at his house. And when the servants arrived, one of the men who were invited drew his sword and hit him, and the servant fell down dead. Now Sichar, who was there, was a personal friend of the priest. And as soon as he heard about this, he seized his weapons and went to the church to wait for Ostrogiesel. And when Ostrogiesel was informed about this, he snatched up his own weapons and went to look for Sikar. And a pitched battle then ensued. And so basically what happens is a priest in this village goes to someone's Christmas party and invites people at that party to come over for drinks. And those people are probably already so drunk that one of them takes a sword and kills the messenger that the priest sent over there. And then Sichar, who's a friend of the priest, gets angry about this, and a brawl ensues. And in the course of this brawl, Ostrogiesel, who's associated with the person who killed the servant of the priest, and Sikar begin fighting. As the fight began, Sikar then ran away. And once Sikar had fled, Ostrogiesel launches a second attack, killing Sikar's 4 servants. The 2 parties were then called up before a tribunal of citizens, and their verdict was that Ostrogiesel, who had committed murder, killed Sikar's servants and removed his goods without having any right to them, and he was guilty in the eyes of the law. Okay, so this is pretty straightforward. We see, for example, there was an offense, right? The killing of the priest's servant, and then the killing of 4 of Sikar's servants and stealing some of Sikar's property. Ostrogiesel is guilty of the offense, and there's a trial, and Ostrogiesel is found guilty at that trial. Now, the only thing that's really different from a Roman system is there's a tribunal of citizens that do this instead of a larger imperial sanctioned administrative structure. But this is something that's vaguely recognizable in a Roman context. There's an offense. The person responsible for that offense is brought up on trial. He's found guilty. And what follows, if this is Roman, what follows is very clearly not. Because a few days after the case had been heard, Sikar heard that the goods which Ostrogiesel had stolen were now in the hands of a man called Auno's son, and his brother Eberulf. Sikar then dismissed the tribunal from his mind as if it had never happened, and he sought the help of a certain Auginus. and they started a battle by attacking those 3 men with a gang of armed men. And so there is a verdict, but Sikar kind of disregards the fact that there was even a verdict, and instead he attacks now a third party, somebody who is possessing the goods that had been stolen from Sikar. And in this attack in the third party, there's more violence done, there's more damage done, and now a third person is involved in this. At this point, Gregory, who is the bishop who oversees affairs in this small area, intervenes, and he orders Sikar to appear before him. And he says basically the fighting needs to stop. These people need to make peace. And then he says something interesting. If the problem is that people don't want to pay the fines that have been assessed by the court, Gregory will pay the fine, just so that there can be peace in the region. And he even offers money to the family of the 3 men who were attacked, Auno, Auno's son, and Eberolf. And the nearest relative is a man named Cramazid. Now Cramazid refuses to take the money, and Sikar makes himself ready to talk to the king about this. But while Sikar was getting ready, he is attacked and wounded by a slave, and a rumor then spreads that he's dead. And when Cramazid heard of this, he sent word to his friends and relatives and hurried off to Sikar's house. And he stole everything he could lay his hands on, killed a few slaves, burned down not only Sikar's house, but also all those of the neighbors who lived on the same estate. The parties concerned were then summoned to appear before the judge in the city and to plead their cases. And the judgment of the case was that Cramazid, who had refused to accept the compensation offered, and had then proceeded to burn down the houses, should forfeit half of the sum previously awarded to him. And this decision was made against the letter of the law, in an attempt to persuade them to make peace. And it was further decreed that Sikar should pay the remaining half of the compensation, but in effect the money was provided by the church. Okay, so the settlement terms now are so far from what you would see in a Roman context that it's bordering on ridiculous. So not only does Gregory try to negotiate an agreement and fund the recompense for the murders committed by Sikar, but now, when more vigilante violence has happened and Cramazid has actually stolen all of Sikar's property, there's another tribunal that gets involved. This time it's actually a judge, and it's actually in the city. It's not a citizen tribunal, it's actually a court. And the court then makes a judgment that Gregory says is not actually in keeping with the letter of the law. In essence, it's a compromise judgment saying both sides should pay something and let's move on. But really what happens is, even though legally both Cramazid and Sikar are responsible for some of the compensation that this whole fiasco has made necessary, the money isn't provided by either one of them. The money is provided by the church. And this does actually calm things down. There's a legal judgment against both of them. Neither one of them it's not a legal judgment made in accordance with the law, but both of them are willing to move on from this because neither one of them actually has to pay anything. Gregory pays for it. And this is the end of the initial case. Everybody does move on. But a few years later, Sikar and Cramazid have not only made up, but they've become friends. And one night they're having drinks together. And Sikar then, in a kind of drunken conversation, taunts Cramazid about the settlement and says that Cramazid should be grateful for having his relations killed because now Cramazid is a rich man. He's gotten all of this compensation, and it's something that he should really be happy about. Gregory says, when he heard Sikar's remarks, Cramazid was sick at heart. If I don't avenge my relatives, he said to himself, they will say that I'm as weak as a woman, for I no longer have the right to be seen as a man. And he then kills Sikar. And there's another trial. And Cramazid said at that trial, in essence, that the murder is justified because his family was insulted. And Gregory says, the judgment was that Cramazid must prove that he had taken life in order to avenge an affront, and this he did. And so, in the end, what we have here is something that is so far beyond what the Roman legal system would do. There's not even really a legal system. There's a mixture of vigilante violence, attempts to find some recompense that will stop the vigilante violence, and ultimately a sanctioning that in some occasions vigilante violence is perfectly fine. But none of these things really add up to a comprehensible system that allows law to govern interactions in post-Roman Gaul. This is a mess. It's a mess that is more or less held together only by the authority of individuals and the willingness of people in the community to listen to those authoritative individuals. But what the law says is not governing how these decisions are made and what kinds of actions are permissible. And so there is some structure to how these things are working, but it is definitely not a legal structure like that once was there in Rome. But there's one last element I want to touch upon in relation to Gaul and what Gaul looks like after the Romans leave, or after Roman control fades away. And this is the role of literature and culture. And this is intriguing because we know from the late 3rd century, we have a very well documented history of Gallic literary culture, and it is vibrant. It's really, really impressive. And this continues all the way through Sidonius. And Sidonius's education in Gaul is done in much the same way as education had been done across the 3rd and 4th centuries. It's a very well-integrated classical education, and people with this education continued to have the same kind of prominent role in society that, for example, Ammianus Marcellinus described in the 4th century. Education mattered. It remained the lubricant that brought together all of these different elites and made their interactions possible. And this is true all the way through the life of Sidonius and the career of Sidonius into the 470s and 480s. So what happens when you get into the 6th century, when you get into this reality, like the kind of world that Gregory is describing? Does culture die away? Well, the answer is more complicated, because by the time Siccar and Cramnizid are going at it, the picture in Gaul is somewhat different. Unlike Sidonius, who was classically trained in the best schools in a model that looked very much like what the Roman Empire had been doing for a long time, Gregory of Tours is essentially privately taught by a family member. Now, he is a sophisticated author. He knows Latin very well. He is educated. But the structure and the system that provides that education is different. It's now informal. It's not centralized. It's not centrally funded. The big schools and prominent professors of the past have now disappeared. And this would suggest, probably rightly, that the cultural values of the later Roman Empire are no longer as important to the upper classes in Gothic and Frankish Gaul as they were in, say, the 4th century Roman territories in Gaul. But that's not the entire picture, because these things do remain important. There just isn't a mechanism to produce the skills necessary for lots of people to share in these deep kind of training, and educational capacity. But another figure that we can look at gives us a picture that shows us these things do actually remain valued, even if the state doesn't have the capacity to train a lot of people to do them. And this figure is Venantius Fortunatus. Now, Fortunatus is actually an Italian by birth, and he was trained in classical oratory and poetry in Italy. But in the 6th century, he decided to leave Italy and make his fortune as a poet in Gaul. And so he moved north and he attached himself to the Frankish court and then began to write poems in praise of his patrons at the court. And he also wrote poems that describe his own experiences. Now, one of these is sort of comically stupid, and it gives us a great deal to show how important literature is in Frankish society. This is the 8th poem in the 6th book of poems that Fortunatus published. And the poem begins like this: "Why do you ensnare me, O care, in such troublesome complaints? Alas, now at last depart my soul, O grief. Why do you recall my misfortune? The weight of baggage already weighs me down. Why is the burden doubled, which I thought to toss aside?" And so Fortunatus has very clearly endured some tragedy. Something horrible has happened. He makes you understand this immediately. Something terrible has beset him. And what can it be, you're supposed to wonder? What has actually happened that is so upsetting and so disheartening to Fortunatus? Did he lose all of his property? Did his child die? No. As you read through this, you realize the situation is much different. Fortunatus has been traveling with the court on a river cruise. And when we reached the city of Metz, the royal cook stole from me in my absence ship and crew. Did he who snatches food from the flames with a fiery hand not know to keep faith on the waters and to keep his hands off of my boat? Unworthy of being marked by verse rather than by soot, may his foul image reflect the pitch black man. So Fortunatus, the tragedy now is laid out. The tragedy is that the royal cook stole the boat that the royal poet was traveling on. And so Fortunatus now is going to write about this terrible person and this terrible event poetically so that he can signal the injustice that was done to him. So Fortunatus then continues, coming to Naracum, I tell the king my woes, and he laughs, and with a kindly voice he orders a ship to be made available for me. And they hunt for one, but they cannot find a single vessel, for the king's whole assembly was on the waters. And Fortunatus then is forced to stay in the city for some time until one of his friends can arrange for him to get on another boat. So what do we do with this kind of poem? On the one hand, we can read this in a straightforward fashion and say, like Ammianus did in the 380s, well, clearly the priorities are out of whack in the Frankish court. The poet, this literary man with great achievements, is being displaced by the cook. But what Fortunatus is actually doing is something that's more subtle here. He's asserting a kind of power over the situation by using his poem to attack the injustice of this. If it was okay for the cook to depose the poet and steal his ship, nothing would be said about it. The poem would not make any sense. Instead, what Fortunatus is doing is he's describing for an audience that, of course, appreciates the importance of poetry, the injustice of an action that displaces a literary figure in favor of a cook. This is the same game that Ammianus plays 200 years before. He is talking to a literate audience about the injustice done to a literary figure because the literate audience will understand why that is unjust. And notably, what Fortunatus also says is the king acknowledges that it's unjust. Now, while the king laughs, the king also says, I acknowledge that something should be made available to you. He acknowledges the prerogative that someone versed in literary culture should have. So how do we read this? Is this a sign of decline? On one level, perhaps yes. Fortunatus is a poet working in Gaul, but he's not a Gallic-produced poet. And so the structures that were once in Gaul to produce people like Fortunatus no longer exist. But the value attached to somebody like Fortunatus is very clear. And what this poem does is very similar to what that discussion that Ammianus did 200 years earlier. What it indicates to us is that not only did Fortunatus think he was important, but other people did too. And this poem works because this poem highlights an imbalance between what should happen and what actually did happen. And the people reading this will understand that that imbalance is real and that it is something that needed to be rectified. And so in the end, when we think about post-Roman Gaul, we have to understand that the process of decline and the process of change is very complicated. In some ways, it's very clear that the legal system is not as sophisticated and is not as functional once Gaul leaves Roman control. Territorially, of course, the empire no longer controls this territory, and so territorially, there is Roman decline. But we also see that the situation is more complicated. Gaul doesn't completely collapse, and elements of Gallic society are still quite functional. And so is this decline or is this transformation? Arguments can be made for both things. And this is why arguments about Roman decline are so complicated. There is no straightforward way to measure decline. And there's no straightforward way to talk about what will constitute such things and what actually matters in this sort of discussion. And so as we turn our attention to other parts of the West that fall out of Roman control, we will see that these dynamics play out in different ways, but they are always there. Elements of continuity with the Roman past remain in all of the regions that leave Roman control in the 5th century. But there's also dramatic differences. And it's important to keep in mind that those differences may be positive. They may also be negative. In coming up with an assessment of how we measure this change, we have to be open to the fact that it is not going to be one linear progression in either a positive or negative direction. The picture will be messy, and that messiness is good. It allows us to better understand what's happening and not impose a single paradigm that inaccurately represents the realities of the situation.